Trump's strike on Iran has triggered a growing backlash not only from Democrats and foreign policy critics, but from inside the U.S. military and from within parts of his own political coalition, turning what was presented as a decisive use of force into a widening crisis of credibility, strategy, and political control. What is making this moment so serious is not just that the United States launched major strikes on Iranian targets. It is that the operation is now being followed by contradictory explanations, reported warnings from senior military leaders before the strikes, rising concern about the cost of a wider regional war, and visible fractures inside the movement that helped bring Trump back to power. According to reporting cited in the source material, senior military officials, including members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised serious concerns before the strikes were authorized. Those concerns reportedly included the risk of a wider regional conflict, the danger to American personnel, and the pressure an expanded war could place on already depleted weapons stockpiles. That point is critical. Because if top military advisors were warning in formal briefings that a strike on Iran could weaken long-term U.S. strategic capacity, then this was never just a question of whether the operation could hit its targets. It was also a question of whether the United States could afford the broader consequences. That is where the credibility problem begins. Trump publicly dismissed reporting that top military leadership had opposed going to war with Iran, calling it completely wrong. But subsequent reporting, including from CNN as referenced in the transcript, indicated that the concerns were in fact real, that they came from multiple senior military figures, and that they were raised directly in formal briefings. If that account is accurate, then the White House now faces a serious problem. Either the president did not fully absorb what his own military advisors were telling him, or he heard those warnings, ignored them, and then publicly denied they had been made. Neither option is politically harmless. Because when the commander-in-chief is seen as contradicting or overruling his own military leadership on a decision of this scale, the question becomes larger than the strike itself. The question becomes whether the public is being given a coherent account of how and why the country entered this conflict. That is why this story now sits at the center of U.S. politics, global politics, and a fast-developing international news cycle tied to war powers, military judgment, and the use of force in the Middle East. Then came the operational escalation. The United States did not stop at a symbolic action. It launched broad strikes on Iranian targets, and in the days that followed, additional attacks continued. One of the most controversial reported incidents involved a strike that investigators were said to be examining as a likely U.S. attack, with casualty figures reaching close to 150 dead, including indications that a school may have been among the affected sites. If those findings hold, the political impact could be severe. Because once civilian casualty numbers of that scale begin circulating, the administration is no longer defending only the strategic logic of the operation. It is also defending the human and legal consequences of how that force was used. And the White House response, as framed in the source material, has only intensified criticism. Trump's own language suggested a willingness to accept casualties as part of war, without offering a fuller public accounting, a visible sense of urgency around investigation, or a detailed explanation of what had happened. That matters because in conflicts like this, public legitimacy depends not only on the target set or the strategic objective, but on whether the administration appears serious about consequences when civilians are killed. A dismissive tone in the face of a major casualty event does not calm the situation. It hardens opposition to the war. That opposition is now coming from more than one direction. On the Democratic side, critics are attacking the operation as unauthorized, strategically incoherent, and potentially illegal depending on the justification being used. But the more dangerous problem for the White House may be on the Republican side, because the justifications for the war appear to have shifted rapidly. That is the next major pressure point. According to members of Congress and reporting referenced in the transcript, the public rationale for the operation has moved through multiple frames in just a short period of time. At first, the focus was Iran's missile threat. Then the emphasis shifted toward Iran's nuclear capabilities. Then toward protecting allies. But each of those explanations raises different legal, strategic, and political questions. If Iranian nuclear infrastructure had already been completely and totally obliterated, as the White House claimed, then what ongoing threat justified the new escalation? If the primary threat was to Israel rather than directly to the United States, then the constitutional and legal foundation for direct U.S. military action becomes much more contested. And if Pentagon briefers were telling congressional staff that the issue was not an imminent Iranian strike on America, but a fear that Iran would retaliate against the U.S. if another country attacked it, then the whole public case changes again. Those narratives do not sit comfortably together. And that is why critics are now arguing that the administration made the decision first and then searched for a justification afterward. In political terms, that is one of the most dangerous accusations a White House can face during a war. Because once the public starts to believe that the rationale for military action is shifting in real time, trust erodes quickly. And in a war, trust is not a side issue. It is part of the strategic terrain. This is where the story becomes bigger than one strike package or one press cycle. What is emerging is a picture of a military operation launched amid internal warnings, defended through inconsistent public explanations, and now carrying casualty, cost, and escalation risks that may be much larger than originally sold. That is why this is not just another war story. It is a story about how American power actually functions when the battlefield, the chain of command, and the political coalition behind the operation all begin pulling in different directions at once. In the next part, I'm going to break down the fracture inside Trump's own coalition, why the anti-war promise that helped define MAGA is now under pressure, and how the internal political backlash may become just as important as the military front itself. The political backlash is no longer coming only from outside Trump's coalition. It is now coming from inside the movement that helped define his return to power, and that is what makes this phase of the story so consequential. For years, one of the central promises of the MAGA coalition was opposition to new foreign wars, especially in the Middle East. That was not a side message. It was foundational. It appeared in campaign speeches, rallies, interviews, and the broader argument that the United States had spent too much blood and money in conflicts that did not serve ordinary Americans. Trump himself repeatedly told supporters he would not send American troops into new Middle Eastern wars, and many of the most influential voices around him built their own credibility on that same promise. Now that promise is under strain. As the strikes on Iran expand and the explanations for the operation continue shifting, prominent voices from inside the America First movement are beginning to ask whether the administration has crossed the very line it once swore it would never cross. That is not just a messaging problem. It is a coalition problem. Because once the anti-war wing of Trump's base begins to feel betrayed, the conflict is no longer simply about whether Democrats oppose the war. It becomes a test of whether the administration can hold together the political identity that got it back into office. That is what makes the internal criticism so important. The voices raising alarm are not random outsiders. They are people who spent years defending non-interventionism, arguing against regime change, and telling voters that the era of endless Middle East wars was over. Their argument now is that the administration is betraying that exact promise. Some are openly asking where high-profile figures associated with anti-war or anti-intervention positions have gone, and why those figures are not speaking more forcefully now that military escalation is underway. That question carries weight because it suggests that silence from within the coalition is itself becoming politically visible. And then the criticism gets sharper. Some of those voices are now saying something much more damaging than simple disagreement. They are suggesting that American service members are being placed in harm's way not for a direct U.S. emergency, but for a conflict tied to the security priorities of another country. Whether fair or not, that is a devastating line inside a movement that has always emphasized America first. Because once supporters start saying American troops are being put at risk for someone else's strategic agenda, the emotional and moral center of the coalition begins to shift. That is not a routine dispute. It is a rupture. At the same time, Democrats are seizing on the same fractures from a different direction. Members of Congress are pointing to the operation as another example of war being launched with unstable justifications, escalating costs, and no coherent public objective. Some are explicitly comparing the current moment to earlier conflicts in which shifting claims and incomplete intelligence were used to build support for actions that later lost public legitimacy. That comparison is politically dangerous because once Iraq-era parallels begin to enter the conversation, every contradiction in the administration's story becomes more explosive. And those contradictions are accumulating. Was this primarily about Iran's missile capability? Was it about nuclear risk? Was it about protecting Israel? Was it about preempting retaliation? Depending on which official statement or briefing one looks at, the answer changes. That is exactly why the operation is becoming harder to defend politically. A war can survive fierce opposition if the public believes the objective is real and clearly understood. But when the objective appears to change from day to day, the debate shifts from policy disagreement to trust. This is where public opinion becomes central. According to the polling referenced in the transcript, majorities of Americans do not trust Trump to make the right decisions on the use of force regarding Iran, and many do not believe he has a clear plan. That matters more than any single press statement, because once public confidence in command judgment drops below a certain point, everything else becomes harder to sell. The administration can still rally its strongest supporters, but it loses the broader presumption of competence that is crucial during a live military conflict. And that problem is not isolated to one side of the aisle. The fracture is visible inside the Republican coalition itself. On one side are traditional hawks pushing for more escalation, broader strikes, and an even more aggressive regional posture. On the other side are the anti-war populists and America First voices who see this as exactly the kind of entanglement they were promised would end. Trump now sits at the center of that collision, trying to hold both camps at once. That is politically unstable, because the more the conflict expands, the harder it becomes to tell each side what it wants to hear. This is why the internal fight may matter as much as the war itself. Because presidents can sometimes absorb external opposition more easily than internal ideological fracture. If Democrats attack, the White House can frame it as partisan. If major pieces of the president's own movement turn against the operation, that is much harder to contain. It cannot be dismissed as opposition politics. It becomes evidence that the war is breaking the coalition from within. And this is exactly why the administration's messaging has grown so defensive. It is not just trying to justify the strikes to the country. It is trying to justify them to its own base. In the next part, I'll break down the economic and strategic costs now hanging over this conflict, why the $1 billion a day estimate matters so much, and how war spending, weapons stockpile pressure, and energy risk are turning this from a political controversy into a larger test of U.S. capacity and endurance. The cost of this conflict is no longer an abstract budget issue. It is becoming a real test of how much strain the United States can absorb militarily, economically, and politically if the operation continues into a longer regional confrontation. According to the reporting cited in the transcript, the estimated operational cost of the war is running at roughly $1 billion per day. If that pace were sustained through September, the total could move into the range of around $150 billion in direct operating cost alone. That figure does not include the longer-term expense of rebuilding weapons stockpiles, replacing munitions, compensating for broader readiness losses, or managing the economic ripple effects that flow from prolonged instability in the Middle East. That is why the cost question matters so much. Because the administration is not defending a small strike package or a short punitive raid. It is defending an operation that could reshape the federal budget conversation, military planning assumptions, and energy market expectations all at once. Once the daily price tag reaches this scale, the war stops being judged only by strategic intention. It starts being judged by what else that money cannot do at home. That is already becoming part of the backlash. Critics are drawing a direct contrast between the cost of the conflict and stalled domestic priorities, arguing that the government can suddenly find vast sums for war while claiming restraint or delay on social spending, healthcare, or other internal policy commitments. That line resonates politically because it simplifies the trade-off. It asks voters to look at billions spent on a war with shifting justifications and compare it to promises made to working Americans that still remain unmet. And that is only the financial side. The strategic side may be even more serious. Senior military leaders reportedly warned before the strikes that the cost of going in would not only be measured in lives, but in long-term strategic capacity. That phrase matters because it points directly to the issue of stockpiles. The United States is not operating from an unlimited reserve of missiles, munitions, and long-range strike capacity. It has been supplying Ukraine, maintaining commitments in the Pacific, managing force posture in the Middle East, and dealing with broader production constraints that predate this crisis. If a new war consumes high-end inventory faster than industry can replace it, the problem is not just accounting. It is readiness. That is why this story matters so much in global politics and foreign policy. A war can weaken a country even when it wins tactically if it consumes too much strategic capacity in the process. That is exactly what some military advisors appear to have been warning about. The danger was not simply that Iran could retaliate. The danger was that a larger conflict would pull the United States deeper into another major theater at a time when its arsenal and industrial base were already under pressure. And the Middle East is not a closed system. That point cannot be stressed enough. If the war continues, its effects move outward immediately. The Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz remain central to global energy transit. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that waterway. If Iran closes it, even partially or temporarily, the impact would hit fuel markets, transport costs, inflation expectations, and supply chains across the globe. Europe would feel it. Asia would feel it. American consumers would feel it at the pump. The military advisors reportedly understood that escalation risk from the beginning, which is why they were raising concerns before the strikes were authorized. Markets understand it too. Defense stocks, energy futures, shipping risk, airline exposure, insurance pricing, all of these are part of the real-time adjustment already underway. This is not cable news theater. It is the pricing of war risk into the actual structure of the economy. Once major institutional investors and commodities desks begin recalculating around an open-ended regional conflict, the political effects can follow quickly. What begins as a military decision then becomes a household cost issue, an inflation issue, a supply chain issue, and eventually an electoral issue. That is why the conflict is now operating on multiple levels at once. On the battlefield, the administration is trying to degrade Iranian capacity. In financial markets, the world is trying to price how big the disruption could become. In Washington, the political system is trying to determine whether the administration has a coherent objective and a viable off-ramp. And inside the Republican coalition, the movement is trying to decide whether this war is a betrayal of its founding promise or an unavoidable assertion of American strength. Those levels cannot be separated anymore. And that is what makes this so dangerous. Once the domestic political, economic, and strategic costs begin interacting, wars become much harder to control. The administration can still win arguments on one front and lose on another. It can still claim military progress while seeing political support erode. It can still strike targets successfully while weakening its own stockpiles and widening energy stress. That is the kind of contradiction some of the early warnings were pointing toward. At this point, the conflict appears to be moving toward one of two paths, and the space between them is narrowing. The first path is the off-ramp. In that scenario, after absorbing enough military damage, Iranian leadership signals through intermediaries that it is ready to negotiate. The United States then presents the strikes as the pressure that made diplomacy possible, claims victory, and begins moving toward a settlement that can be sold politically as proof that force worked. In this version, the administration defines success broadly enough to allow itself an exit without openly admitting retreat. The political fracture inside Trump's coalition remains serious, but it is partially covered over by a victory narrative. That path is still possible. But it requires several conditions to hold at once. Iran would have to decide that continued conflict is more costly than strategic endurance. The administration would have to accept an outcome short of total transformation while still calling it a decisive success. Allies and markets would have to believe that the danger of wider war had begun receding. And perhaps most importantly, the White House would have to stop shifting its justifications long enough to present a stable end state. That is a high bar, but not an impossible one. The second path is the spiral. In that version, Iran or one of its proxies retaliates directly against American personnel or assets. The White House then faces a politically impossible choice: absorb the strike and look weak, or respond and push the war into a wider regional phase. A response then produces further retaliation. The conflict becomes explicitly regional. More actors are pulled in. The cost rises far beyond the current $1 billion a day estimate. Energy shocks deepen. The fracture inside the Republican coalition becomes much harder to manage. And the credibility gap between what was promised and what was delivered widens into something the administration cannot paper over. That is the path many critics now fear most. Because once the conflict enters that loop, the administration loses control over the timeline. It stops being able to say this is a short operation with a clear endpoint. It becomes a reactive war, shaped by the next strike, the next casualty, the next market move, the next escalation through the Strait of Hormuz, and the next contradiction in the White House explanation. This is why the coherence problem matters so much. If the administration had entered the war with one clear objective, one stable legal justification, and one consistent public explanation, it would still face serious opposition, but it would at least have a narrative framework. Instead, according to the material in your transcript, the public case has moved from imminent threat to missiles to nukes to ally protection and back again. That kind of instability is not just bad communications. It is evidence of a war whose political rationale was never fully settled before the operation began. And that is one of the most damaging facts in the story. Because once the public begins to suspect that the administration made the decision first and then searched for a reason, everything else becomes more fragile. Casualties become harder to justify. Costs become harder to defend. Polling turns more dangerous. Allies grow more cautious. And critics inside the coalition gain more credibility every time the explanation changes again. That is where the story stands now. The United States has entered a military conflict with a major regional power despite documented warnings from senior military advisors, with casualty events already generating controversy, with an estimated cost of $1 billion a day, with public opinion moving against the operation, and with a political coalition at home showing signs of real ideological fracture. Those are not separate problems. They are now parts of the same problem. And that is why this conflict may become a defining test of how American power actually works under pressure. Not just whether it can destroy targets, but whether it can sustain legitimacy. Not just whether it can launch strikes, but whether it can explain them coherently. Not just whether it can project force, but whether it can do so without breaking the political coalition that put that force in motion. So the central question now is no longer whether the strikes happened. It is what happens next when the political cost of the war and the strategic cost of the war begin colliding in the same space. If the administration finds an exit, it will try to call that exit victory. If it fails, the contradiction at the heart of this moment becomes unavoidable. A movement built on rejecting foreign wars will have been pulled into one, and a White House that claimed control will be judged by how much it failed to hold together its own rationale, its own coalition, and its own promise. That is where things stand. The battlefield is active. The political architecture is cracking. The price is climbing. And the next move may determine whether this remains a brutal but limited episode or becomes the beginning of something much larger, costlier, and harder to reverse.